All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our last webinar for the season on managing native forages. So tonight's webinar is co-hosted by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, as well as the Beef Cattle Research Council. My name is Stacey Domilewski. I'm the Science and Extension Coordinator for the BCRC, and I'll be your moderator for tonight. Our session is going to last for approximately 1 hour, but it could go a little bit longer depending on the number of questions you have during our question and answer period. If you're on Twitter, I invite you to tweet along with us using #BeefWebinar. We are recording this session, and I'll email out a link to you to join to watch the recording later this week. So if you missed hearing anything tonight and want to watch it again later, you can. Of course, for tonight's webinar, you'll be able to hear and see our presenters, but we can't hear or see you. So if you do want to communicate with us, please type into the small chat window on the control panel on the side of your screen. If you have questions or comments for our presenter tonight, that's where you can put them. Enter your questions at any time, but we'll answer them all at the end of the hour. If your internet connection is being a bit slow tonight, it might help to close the webcam window. You won't be able to see us, but it'll hopefully get the audio to come through a little bit clearer and the slides to load a little better. Another option is if you're connected to any external hard drives or any external web systems, if you close those down, that'll help to load things a bit faster as well. All right, so let's get started. So the first thing I want to announce, if you haven't seen it on social media already, we do have some door prizes tonight. So we will be drawing from everybody who's attending live tonight for the book Cool Forages, which has been donated to us from AAFC. So thank you very much for that. And we'll be sending an email out to the winners after the webinar. So this is what we're going to be covering tonight. So I'd like to get things started here and introduce our first speaker of the night. So our first speaker is Dr. Alan Iwaasa. He was raised on a grain and cattle farm in southern Alberta, and his current research interests include native and tame grazing pasture management, animal-plant grazing interface relationships, assessing and improving forage quality, rumen nutrition, and development of economical and environmentally sustainable grazing systems. Alan is the Grazing Management Ruminant Nutrition Research Scientist at AAFC in Swift Current. So I'll just get you to turn your webcam and your microphone as well, Alan.
All right, do you hear me?
Perfect, yeah, everything's good.
Okay, so I can just move this over. All right, so Stacey, thank you very much for that introduction. I think, am I ready to proceed then?
Yes, you are.
All right, well, good evening to anybody that's tuned in to this webinar. I appreciate the time that you're taking to listen to me, and hopefully this evening I'll be able to share with you just some various areas of my research. The topic area is very large, and so as a result of that, I won't be able to really cover in depth a lot of these areas, but hopefully I will stimulate some ideas and stimulate some thoughts for you in your own ranching or farming operation in pertaining to really looking at the potential use of natives, not only in your natural grasslands, but also the potential as far as seeding natives back into some of your production land. So the title of my presentation tonight is really a little bit different than what the webinar initial title was, but not much difference. It's really the establishment and the management of native seeded forages. And that's what I will really concentrate a little bit on tonight with you. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a background of who I am. Definitely, as Stacey had mentioned, I'm from the Swift Current Research and Development Center that's associated with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. I was raised on a mixed irrigation farm in a small farming community called Ruminant, Alberta. And I was raised there, and part of a 3 sons were part of my dad. In essence, my dad is right there, and my 2 oldest brothers, and then myself there, the cute one, being the youngest of the family in southern Alberta. I did my undergraduate and my master's degree at the University of Saskatchewan in the Department of Animal and Poultry Science, and I did my PhD at the University of Guelph in Ontario. And I started my research career here at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Swift Current in 2000. So the Swift Current Research and Development Center is really quite special in the sense that it is the only AAFC research center that is located in a semi-arid prairie or ecoregion. And this particular ecoregion, or the brown soils areas, encompasses over 20% of the arable lands in Canada. The Swift Current Research and Development Center was really established in 1920 with strong forage research program, and since the 1930s has really had a research focus looking at native species as well in the areas of range management, range ecology, and those various disciplines. Just taking a look at the various research facilities within Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, particularly for Western Canada, here in this area here, we only really have very few research centers that have the abilities in which they can do cattle and pasture research. And us here in Swift Current, we're one of the fortunate ones that can look not only at the forages as they grow and making selections, but also the interaction that they play with grazing animals. And looking at the end user, in this case, the animals are the end users that are utilizing the forage material. Some of the other research areas that I have focused on is really looking at greenhouse gases and evaluating some of those greenhouse gases and their effect on the environment, looking at soil organic carbon levels and how various perennial forages and undergrazing systems may influence soil organic carbon levels. Really looking at development of best management grazing practices or best management practices and trying to evaluate how those best management practices are utilized, particularly for Western Canada, and looking as far as grazing legumes as well as native grasses, and trying to get a better idea of how the animals not only prefer certain grasses or forages or forbs or legumes, and how they are utilizing these forages for animal growth and production. We also are looking at a number of different forages and some of their benefits, such as growing on saline lands or in areas that have high salinity, and also able to control certain weed problems that we have. And also looking at all throughout the entire grazing season and throughout the entire life cycle of cow-calf, as well as backgrounding and yearling animals, and looking at different feeding strategies to try to reduce costs and also to improve performance of those animals for the producer. My presentation this evening will really look at this particular outline. I'll just go through very briefly some background on the Canadian grasslands, and then looking at working with Mother Nature. That's the primary focus that I want to try to do my research, and looking at how we can work with Mother Nature and not against her, and the benefits that natives do play to achieve a more sustainable and resilient forage, and that has grazing production benefits. Also, I'm going to share with you a study that we had conducted, in which it's the reestablishment of 2 different mixed native grasslands in a southern Saskatchewan perspective. And I do apologize that much of my talk is really centered around southern Saskatchewan or the brown soil zones, and for Western Canada's use. I'll look at the effects of different grazing system managements and how that influences or affects native grass production systems. And finally, at the very end, I'll just have a few take-home messages and synthesize it down to some various implications or points from my presentation. All right, so let's begin. Let's take a look at the North American grasslands. The Great Plains, or the Northern Great Plains, in which we're associated with in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba. You can kind of see that area associated there in the green. And we're at the northern fringe of the Great Plains. And predominantly for us in the southern areas of Saskatchewan, we're in the short grass and mixed grass eco areas or ecoregion. There are essentially around 320 million hectares associated with this grasslands, the Great Plains. And you kind of saw where I'm located here in Swift Current. The Western Canadian grasslands is a very important resource that we have, and sometimes we take it for granted and not realizing how invaluable this resource is. The remaining natural grasslands for Western Canada is estimated to be only about 11.4 million hectares that only remains now, compared to what was once thought that we had around 61.5 million hectares. This particular figure, or this particular graph that you have here, kind of shows what was once thought that there was as far as the entire ecoregion that was contained for these grasslands, to now what is really only remaining in the darker regions that were inventoried or were tallied in 2013. So you can see a large, vast majority of the grasslands has been lost. The total natural grasslands that we have in Alberta is around 5.6 million hectares, and Saskatchewan has about 4.6 or 4.7 million hectares, and Manitoba has about 1.1 million hectares. So as I said earlier, my research attempts to really work with Mother Nature, and really that's the need to work with Mother Nature and develop environmental and economically sustainable grazing or animal production systems. Really, I'm looking at less inputs, reducing fertilizers or machinery inputs, corrals, buildings, or even the labor. Really letting the animal itself be the major conduit in which harvesting the forages and living off the land. Really extending the grazing season and letting the animal harvest the material and deposit that fertility back onto the land is a central part of my grazing program. So utilizing native species, it's difficult to envision a selection of tame or introduced grasses that could provide the tolerance and the ability to adjust to changing environmental conditions from one extreme to another. I don't think any of us doubts the fact that we're having lots of changes occurring in our environment. Our winters or summers or springs seem to fluctuate very much from what we used to remember. This is where we need forage species that can really be adaptive to these extreme, sometimes extreme environmental conditions. Native species are generally long-lived and contribute to making a more sustainable ecosystem. And they're very long-lived, and so once you get them established, they can be there for a generation of a time. Native pastures can provide a really excellent forage resource and good animal performance, and the animals can really do quite well on native pastures. The relative merits of native versus tame forage species for use on rangelands and on better land-based pastures has really been a controversial topic. And sometimes there is a lot of extreme emotionalism in these areas. I don't try to get into that. I am trying to find what's the best forage that will work for the particular producer. And I think native species as well as tame species have merits and can be used quite effectively if you have the land base in our grazing systems for Western Canada. Seed costs for natives can be quite variable. Therefore, it's important to plan ahead and have an idea on what native species are of interest to you in your specific or particular pasture system. There are other benefits to having native grasslands besides just the grazing and forage production. Native grasslands are important repositories of biodiversity and soil organic carbon. An uncultivated grasslands of Western Canada can contain as much as 2 to 3 billion tons of soil organic carbons to the depths of 1 meter. Soil organic carbon provides associated ecosystem co-benefits, and these are the things to remember. Besides just having this carbon there, the carbon has many benefits to the entire ecosystem and to that grasslands, such as increased soil water holding capacity, better soil structure, improved soil quality and nutrient cycling, and reduced soil erosion. By having more organic matter there, you have a lot more healthier soil system and more resilient to those things that might come in the environment or ups and downs as far as climate change that could affect that grassland. So we do have some land base that is being annually cropped that might be best utilized in more of a perennial type system or forage system. For this reason, the potential to use carbon sequestration in our native grasslands for carbon offsets or carbon credits is something that has become a very important and of interest to a lot of people because of the vast majorities of our grasslands, and because even in Saskatchewan we have over 3 million hectares of cultivated land in crops that are in environmentally sensitive area. Some of that land base could be converted to perennial cover, could be reseeded maybe back to native perennial grasslands. There is the potential to sequester lots of amounts of carbons as a result of this. Native grasslands, because of their nature or because of what they've been here for many, many years, they place a lot of their biomass production below ground. In native plants, 3 to 4 times the above ground biomass can be found in the root material. As a result of this, you can imagine that large amounts of carbon can be sequestered into some of these soils. And native grasses have done this so that they can be resilient against droughts and various other conditions to make sure that the plant itself will survive. The industry and consumers are interested in sustainable beef as a socially responsible and environmentally sound and economically viable product that prioritizes the planet, people, animal, and progress. That's essentially what sustainable beef is looking towards. Natural resources such as the environment, stewardship, and reducing net greenhouse gas emissions and air and water qualities are now factors or are items that are being associated with having good practices that are environmentally friendly and also sustainable beef production systems. This is something that is being felt throughout the world, and particularly in North America. And many big companies are really marketing or looking at the potential to promote sustainable beef productions, such as companies as Cargill, Tyson, Walmart, Costco, and yes, indeed, even McDonald's are looking at the idea of promoting sustainable beef. Within Canada, we are also having the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. So it's something that is recognized as something that is important for the industry, for the producer, and for the public as a whole to recognize that the beef system or the beef production is working towards environmentally and sustainable practices. So, Stacy, I'm not sure how you wanted to do this first question.
All right, so we'll launch the poll questions now. So for everybody on the webinar, this is your chance to participate in tonight's webinar. So the poll question will show up on your screen here, and your answers here are anonymous to everybody else who's on the webinar. So the question for the first poll is, would more information on best management practices to increase carbon sequestration on grasslands be of value to you on your operation? So yes, no, and unsure are your options here. Give everybody a couple more seconds here to get their answers in. All right. So it looks like the answers here, it looks like about 89% of people say yes, and 11% say they're unsure. So back to you, Alan.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate everyone taking the time to answer that. One of the reasons why I had that question there is that we live in a time where we're faced with a lot of these uncertainties in regards to carbon tax, carbon credits, carbon sequestrations, and the various implications that that may have for not only us in Western Canada, but throughout all of Canada. One of the things that we have the benefit of is that agriculture is a very good system, particularly beef production, in which there are opportunities in which we can actually mitigate certain greenhouse gas and actually reduce our carbon profile. And so I just wanted to see what the various audience out there thought about the whole idea of carbon sequestration and how much they were aware of that. All right. The next thing I just wanted to draw your attention to is that I've taken some of the information from these two references or publications that you can gain access to on the website. There's a lot of information in there on building or rebuilding your land with native grasses, and this was actually a publication that came from Ducks Unlimited Canada, as well as a number of other partners. This other publication, The Management of Canadian Prairie Rangeland, is also another excellent publication that you can refer to. It's relatively recent. In 2010 it came out by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and gives you not only the background about rangelands, but various other practices such as grazing and various other seeding and implications that how you can best manage your present or future rangelands. And then just underneath you'll be able to see the website reference to that. Okay, Stacy, I seem to be stuck.
All right. So what I'll get you to try and do, see if you can minimize your presentation.
Okay. Well, I guess it's working now.
Perfect.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Okay, that was a good thing. Okay, so looking at this study here, the seeding of mixed native grasslands and the reestablishment of a study, this was a land base that was annually cropped or cultivated since 1920, and we did a fairly extensive herbicide treatment to try to control weeds using Roundup in the fall and in the spring. We used a common air seeder, a Bagot air seeder, was used to seed into standing stubble. So this was land that was, as I said, annually cropped, and so it was cropped with a cereal, and so we had a good stubble there. You can kind of see the row spacings as well as the seed depth that we were using for these native mixtures. The native mixtures were essentially a simple seed mix at about 9.5 kilograms per hectare, and a complex seed mix was about 9 kilograms per hectare. And so this was a total mixture of different native grasses as well as a forb. And later on in this presentation, I'll be going through what those particular native species were. So in this regards, the one study that we had, which was seeded in 2001, you kind of can see how the establishment process of that was. And this was in the spring into standing stubble, as I said, and this is a study that still is going on to this date, where we have used these pasture areas that we seeded for grazing. We also, because we had such a very good successful stand establishment there, we also did it in another study. This one was into standing stubble, where this one was in land that was cultivated and harrow packed, and this one was seeded in 2006. And then you also can kind of see after 1 year what the stand establishment was for these native mixtures. And the native mixtures had warm and cool season grasses associated with them. So once again, the simple mixture was really a 7-species mixture, and the complex seed mixture contained 12 species. Just taking a look at the simple seed mix, you can see that basically we had cool season grasses, some common one, western, northern, green, and we had one forb or one legume, which was purple prairie clover. All of these seeds were at the time that we started this study in 2000, 2001, that you could get these seeds commercially from a commercial seed provider. In our case, we were getting this from Proven Seeds at that time. In the complex seed mix, you can see that we also have the cool season, but we also had some other grasses, particularly we had some warm season grasses. Once again, we only had one legume or one forb, and that was the purple prairie clover. But we did have some warm season grasses that have a different growth period, and that they would have much of their growth later into the summer. And so as a result of this, this would allow us to maybe extend the grazing season and have vegetated growth occurring at different times in the grazing season. So for successful native seeding, really you have to have proper planning, know what you want to do in preparation of that land base. In our case, to have that land in a good condition as far as not having a lot of weeds, and seeding preparation, proper pre and post seeding weed control, proper selection of what types of native grasses you're interested. Native grasses can be quite expensive, so you want to make sure what you are getting for the seed that you're purchasing, and you want to make sure that the native seed is adapted to your area. And once again, as even was our case, you have to have a lot of patience, and it also helps if Mother Nature kind of gives you some rain through this whole process. So this just shows you a number of pictures of what after 2000, when we had seeded it. This was 2002, in which this is what those native pastures looked like with the animals grazing in it. 2007, that was in July period of time. You can kind of see what the grasses we're looking at. 2010 and 2016, those native grasses. It's important to note that in 2001, in the Swift Current or southern Saskatchewan area, and very much throughout Western Canada, we had a very severe drought situation. So by having the proper preparation of the land and getting the seed in there, we felt really good to see how resilient or how tough those native grasses are. And once they can get established, we were able to see good performance and good longevity of the various species that were there. So just taking a look at the available forage productions, this was there when we harvested at the end of June, just prior to the animals grazing the pastures of the two native mixtures. Once again, the simple, which was a 7-species mix, and the complex, which was a 12-species mix. You can kind of see in 2001 we had seeded it, and then we started the grazing process. We had some very good production that occurred right after the seeding process. And 2000 was a very good year because we did get some good moisture, and you can kind of see that we gained that benefit as far as the production on that newly seeded land. And then after that, throughout the number of years that followed, close to that 14 years, you see that pretty well it pretty well remains quite stable, roughly around that 1,000 kilograms of dry matter production per hectare. And some years, in this recent years here in 13, 14, 15, we did see some decline, but with the moisture, we once again got that around that 1,000 kilograms of dry matter. So in comparison to some of the tame forages, such as Russian wild rye after 15 years and crested wheat after 25 years, based on some of the data that we've had from Swift Current, we see that it's under that 1,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. And so these native species do perform quite well. Once again, we have no additional nitrogen fertility was added to any of these systems, as well as with the tame ones. And the production was able to maintain even over a number of different environmental years. Particularly 2001, as I said, was a very dry year. 2007 was a very dry year for us, and 2009. So the native grasses, although they don't have large amounts of production like some of our other tame species that can have these good productions for a relatively a short period of time, maybe 3 to 5 years, the native grasses, since they put a lot of their biomass below ground and they try to weather the storms or weather the different environmental conditions, they can give you some consistent forage productions over different environmental years, even very dry years or even very wet years. So that's some things that's very good to be able to use your native grasses and to be able to count on them. So for an overall average, we surprisingly did not see really any differences between the forage biomass between a simple or a complex mixture. Once again, the complex mixtures had some different warm season grasses there and even some different cool season grasses. But basically, both the simple, the 7 species versus the 12 species, performed similarly overall average for this grazing system. So forage biomass production, native versus tame species. Our results are in agreement with other AAFC studies in Swift Current and Lethbridge, showing no differences in forage production between tame species versus native species. And this is in agreement to Dr. Walter Wilms, who has been a well-known grazing ecologist and research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and Lethbridge. He reported to a question in a study that lasted 12 to 13 years, do tame grasses improve forage production on the northern mixed prairies? And his answer was no. And this research was on brown and dark brown soils. So just like our results show, the native grasses, whether it's simple or whether it's complex, and in his case, he had different native grasses, they performed equally just as good or better than some of the tame grasses such as crested wheat and Russian wild rye, which is what we found. So, Stacy, here are 2 other questions.
All right, so for our first poll question here. So if possible, are you interested in having more native grasslands or seeding native species? All right, so looks like the results for this one, about 77% say yes, they are, and about 23% say they're unsure. All right, so we'll move on to the next poll question here. So is more information needed on how to seed and utilize native species? So on this one, you can select all that apply. So yes, more information is needed on establishment, more information is needed on agronomy, more information is needed on utility, more information is needed on another area, or no. So it looks like some people are still getting answers in here. Okay, we'll end it there. So the results for this poll question. So about 78% of people say yes, more information is needed on establishment. 67 say more is needed on agronomy. 56% say utilization. 19% say another area, and about 8% say no, more information is not needed. Back to you, Alan.
All right, well, thank you very much. The reason why I asked those questions is because there isn't too many researchers, particularly in Canada or even in academia as far as at universities. So it's good to hear that there is interest and that all the answers are not known at this time. As I showed in that earlier slide at the beginning of my presentation, really, Swift Current is one of the last research centers for agriculture and agri-food Canada that is doing active research with natives as well as other tame forages. Okay, so grazing management of native seeded forages, really looking at the season of grazing. The 6 to 8 weeks period of spring to early summer produces about 80% of the yearly forage growth for most forages in Canada. That doesn't matter if it's natives or tames or legumes. So really that period, that early period of the spring, this is a period that these forages are most vulnerable to overgrazing. That is the reason for many of you out there, you know that we do not recommend grazing too early on your natives or even some of your tame forages, because that can have really detrimental effect on their longevity as well as their future production. A moderate stocking rate, light grazing used, and a grazing system that allows for periodical deferral of grazing during spring or early summer. These types of grazing will enable the native species to grow and reproduce year after year. You're allowing that native grass a time to recover or a time to really to set seed and to reproduce, which is very important. Grazing management of native seeded forages in far as grazing intensity, grazing too much creates problems on native grasslands. Stressing out or continually defoliating or clipping it down can weaken and reduce future productions. Leaving 40, 50, or 60% of the leaf area at the end of the grazing period is very critical for good health of majority of our native species. I'm sure some of you have seen various figures or diagrams similar to this showing the high intensity as far as leaving more root material when you have a conservative grazing regime versus a more intense grazing and disturbance of those native grasses. Native versus tame forages. On tame pastures, leaving only 25 to 30% for certain tame forages of the current growth can be quite acceptable. Tame forages have been bred and selected for some of that production and are very aggressive in that regards. In native plants, 3 to 4 times the above ground biomass can be found in that root material. And if you overgraze or stress the plant too much, the native plant, then you will dramatically reduce that below ground root biomass. Grazing management of native seeded forages. What are the different grazing systems? Season-long or continuous grazing systems are quite popular and are used throughout Western Canada and throughout Canada, I'm sure. Livestock have the greatest opportunity to select a high-quality diet under continuous grazing. Light to moderate stocking rates can be used to optimize gain. Some of the reasons why we do look at continuous grazing is that management inputs and capital costs are generally at a minimum. However, the cons is that adequate grazing distribution may be difficult to achieve, and livestock grazing may lead to some plants being overgrazed, and various unpalatable or less preference forage materials will be left in a patchy type existence. By far, we look at another type of grazing system, such as the rotational grazing system. A simple rotation with 1 or 2 additional paddocks or pastures, or a more intensive rotation in which you have more paddocks and more frequent moves. There are a number of different rotational grazing systems, and I won't make the effort to try to go through each one of them. Please check some of that literature that I referred you to earlier. A deferred rotational grazing system is something that I'll share with you tonight, but there's also rest rotation, high intensity, low frequency grazing, short duration grazing, time controlled grazing. And in fact, we have a future study that's really looking at time controlled grazing versus continuous grazing. So hopefully in the future, I'll be able to share with you some of those results. The pros and cons associated with rotational grazing, just as a whole, regardless of which one that you might choose, can increase forage production and provide a longer grazing season by being able to manage those pastures more efficiently. Better distribution of livestock throughout the pasture can be achieved by changing stocking rates or duration of time that the animals are on the pasture. The cons, though, is there are generally higher capital costs associated by having more fencing or more divisions of the pastures into paddocks, and more management input is required as a result of making decisions and monitoring those paddocks or pastures and when to move the animals. Grazing management of native seeded forages, looking at other things in grazing system, as we talked about, the deferred rotational grazing generally includes 4 to 8 pastures with 1 grazing period per season in each pasture or paddock with moderate stocking rates. Year-to-year changes in the order in which the pastures are grazed or paddocks use sequence, or how you are grazing each of the pastures over the different years, can be used to maintain a high level of vigor in preferred plant species, thus improves range conditions and can enhance the recovery of the grasslands. The pros and cons of this particular rotational grazing system is it improves plant vigor and increases utilizations of different plant groups at different times of the seasons of growth. The cons is, once again, that's associated with rotational grazing system, is more management is required. During the spring, in regards to the deferred rotational grazing system, you can have potentially higher grazing pressure being applied, and in the fall, later on, when the majority of the forages may have matured, you have potentially poor forage quality. So we're going to go into this a little bit more on this deferred rotational grazing system. So in our case, just to give you a visual perspective of what our deferred rotational grazing system was, over the grazing season, the spring period, the summer period, and the fall, generally after September, and in the spring, around into the June period, and in the summer, various amounts within July and August period of time. In year 1, we would essentially, I just have to close this down. In year 1, we would start with pasture 1, and then another pasture would be grazed. And you can see that over the various 3 years, each of the pastures is grazed at a different time, at a different period of the entire grazing season. This allows that pasture then to actually rest for a period of time in the summer or fall, and then that allows different forage plants or native plants to actually set seed or recover from the grazing period, whether in the first year it's grazed in the spring, or in the next year in the summer, or in the third year in the fall. There is no really universal best grazing system. Each operation must develop its own grazing management system tailored to its resources and goals. That's very true for you to remember. There's no magic bullet necessarily that will work for everybody. If you have a lot of native, tame, or mixtures of the two, you will have to decide what grazing system will work best for your operation, your particular land base, your particular grazing needs, whether you have cow-calves, yearlings, or backgrounding systems. So the deferred rotational grazing system versus the continuous grazing system was something that carried on as a continuation of the reestablishment of different native mixtures that we seeded in 2001. Once again, we had the deferred rotational grazing versus a continuous grazing system. And the study started in 2005, is still ongoing over 12 years. Like the reestablishment of different native mixtures, we were measuring not only grazing performance and forage performance, but also soil organic carbons, and looking at the changes that were occurring in species under the different grazing systems. So within the pastures, we would have a certain set of pastures that would be grazed in the springtime. Some other different pastures would be grazed in the summertime. And then once again, another set of pastures would be grazed in the fall time. In the next subsequent year, those pastures would change, not being grazed in the springtime, but then maybe being grazed in the summer or fall period of time. And therefore, you're deferring or changing how the grazing is occurring for that pasture. We found some very interesting results that came from this study, really looking at the continuous versus the deferred rotational grazing systems for those various pastures over a 3-year period of time. Those pastures on continuous for the simple versus the complex. We really didn't see much of a difference as far as total live production that was associated with those pasture systems for the continuous. However, for the spring period of time, as well as for the summer period of time, and even in the fall, for the complex pasture mix, we saw an incited improvement in overall total livestock production of over 28% in the spring, 26% in the summer, and 26% or 27% in the fall. Even though for some of those pasture types, simple or complex, the number of grazing days were better or higher for the complex mixture. In this case, for the spring, we had 53 days versus 49, 79 versus 73, 74 versus 67. Even though we had more days that the animals were on those pastures, still it was an incited advantage to have a complex pasture mix. One of the reasons for that is that complex mix, as I said earlier, contained 12 different species. And even though maybe the overall forage biomass production may have not been that much different than the simple, because we had some very aggressive cool season grasses that were in the simple mix, the animal itself has the ability to make selections. The animal can select and choose what forages to consume, which greatly increases the forage quality. In fact, the ability of that animal to select and to then pick what it wants to eat, you can improve the overall diet by 1.5 to 2% higher in forage quality. So in those pastures such as these, with warm season grasses that were still maybe actively growing later in the summer and fall period of time, then the animal was able to select some of that. As well as that native forb that we had, such as purple prairie clover, the animal was able to also make selections throughout the grazing season. So Stacy, here's another question.
Great, so I believe this is our last question for the night. So to utilize native forage species on your operation, do you need more information on how and what species are best for grazing? So the first, yes, I need more information on how to graze them. Yes, I need more information on what species to use. No, I believe there's enough information out there already. And the last one is I'm unsure. And sorry about this, I hit the wrong button, and so this one is only, you're only able to select one, so select the one that applies most to you. Okay, it looks like we have almost everybody in here. So 76% say they do need more information on which species to use. 16% say more information on how to graze them. 5% believe that there is enough information out there already, and 3% are unsure. Back to you, Alan.
Right, thank you. Once again, thank you for taking that time to answer that question. This picture that you have before you is actually what it is, the complex mix that we have now. This was in 2012, and that purplish flower that you see that's prominent throughout that pasture now is actually purple prairie clover. Purple prairie clover is a legume. It's a native legume for Western Canada, and it has some very incredibly interesting things. One of the things that it has a high level of condensed tannins. The condensed tannins that you find in purple prairie clover provide some nutritional benefits. One nutritional benefit is it improves nitrogen use efficiency. The condensed tannins do bind with the protein or nitrogen associated with the plant, and then is later on released in the small intestine. And so as a result of that, you get what's called bypass protein, which can be a huge benefit if you have actively growing animals and a more better efficient use of that nitrogen rather than excreting it out through urine or through the cow dung or the animal dung. Another thing that's associated with the condensed tannins is it's antimicrobial against some of our bacteria that we are concerned about, such as E. coli 0157. In some of the work that we have done with our native pastures, we've actually seen a reduction of the E. coli 0157 E. coli. So it has an animal health benefit as well as a human health benefit for us. The other benefits of the condensed tannins that we're trying to evaluate is that it also will reduce methanogenic bacteria and potentially reduce methane emissions. So just here alone, by having a native legume, could have multiple benefits, not only on the environment, but the health and the production of the animal. The purple prairie clover also fixates nitrogen, and so it also improves the fertility of those pastures. All right, so now we're going to the take-home messages. And feed costs are the single greatest expenditures in cattle operations. Therefore, management of your grazing resources is important for success. Feeding a beef cow is the single most important cost, and on average, 60 to 65% of the total cost of production is associated with that. And we need to use our forages efficiently. We need to look at how we can have the animals on the pasture as long as possible, extending our grazing season. That's always one of our goals that we're striving towards. The difficulty that we have is that there's not a magic bullet. There's not a forage that's going to live or grow throughout the entire year. And so we have to look at how we can best utilize the forages that we have, extending their abilities through stockpiling or swath grazings, or in looking at how we can also complement some of these grazing systems with some supplemented feed. Major limitations in the use of more native species are really the seed prices and the availability. There was a period of time in which the native seeds that we had that were selected and developed by a number of agencies such as Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and Ducks Unlimited were available for producers. And to some extent, those ecovars, as they were called, was an opportunity in which you could get native seed that was developed for our particular area at a very, hopefully, cost-effective price. That has sort of disappeared, and now what you have is a number of seed companies that do have native seeds, but the price can vary depending on market conditions and what seed is available. I did take the time just to look to make sure that you could still get native seeds in regards to those native ones that I had shown in this presentation. And essentially there are at least 3 major seed companies that still do provide that. North Star Seeds, Brett Young Seeds, as well as Crop Production Service. They all do still market native seeds. Native grass and forage pasture systems are sustainable and long-lived. That's something that is very enticing for producers to be able to just seed it and then to be able to have a productive stand for a long period of time. forage production is compatible or better than certain tame species. And the overall pasture production may be similar between simple or complex species richness. However, the important thing to remember is the ability of your grazing animal to make selections among higher biodiversity appears to be can dramatically improve livestock production. So there it is, the advantage by having a more diverse pasture, not just having just crested wheat or not just having western wheatgrass or northern wheatgrass, but by having a little more diversity in there, you can have benefits in your overall livestock production. That also may also apply to environmental benefits as far as carbon sequestrations and such. Native grass and forage pasture systems are sustainable and long-lived. We've been able to see that in our own research. Native species greatly improve soil structure, fertility, and can lead to increased soil organic carbon levels. And so that could have some benefits for the future for producers. Native species root systems occupies a huge underground area and contribute significantly to carbon sequestration potential. Therefore, besides forage and grazing benefits, there is the increased sustainability, resiliency of your pastures. AFC, Swift Current Research Development Center, has successfully established native species. We know that they can grow, and you can use common operating procedures or implements such as zero-till or no-till drills. Can be able to seed native grasses mixtures and successfully have them established. So often I've heard some producers questioning the ability to actually establish native species. There is a protocol that you have to follow. You do have to have some weed control and get the land prepared and make sure you have good native seed, but it is possible. And hopefully the pictures that I showed you gives you that idea. We are looking at how we can improve the grazing and forage performance of natives, looking at different mixtures of native and tame species and combinations, and looking at how different best management practices can be applied to utilizing native species. Native species can complement tame forages in beef productions and are adapted to a low input grazing system. Many producers use their natives later in the season, in which they can guarantee that there is some forage production and that the forage quality is good enough for the animals that they're placing on those pastures. If you are available, please join me and us at our Grazing and Forage Research Tour that will take place at Swift Current in June 27th. This kind of just gives you a little bit of an idea there, in which we'll be showcasing all the various things that I have already mentioned, as well as other things that we have ongoing. In particular, this one right here of these animals looking at grazing preference for particular different native legumes and trying to assess which ones the animals will actually graze. These native and tame legumes give us an idea of how we can best utilize them in different grazing scenarios. So, with that note, I thank you for your attention, and hopefully I've given you something just to think about, and hopefully that you can follow up either by asking questions or visiting us or emailing me some of your questions, and I'd be more than willing to help you or steer you as best as I can into the right direction. Hopefully none of you have been left behind and feeling the effects of that, and I hope that this has been informative as well as giving you something to think about in your own operations, or the potentials to increase your native grasslands. Once again, none of my research could take place unless we had support through the various provincial governments and universities and producers associations. I'm very much appreciative of the support that we get from the Beef Cattle Research Council or the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. These are producer associated, and so each one of you make a huge significant contributions to some of this that helps and promotes the research that we're trying to do. As well as I alone am not doing this work by myself. There are a number of technical people that work with me that really want to do things that will help the producer and the industry in this area of forages and grazing management. So,
all right. Well, thank you very much for that presentation, Alan. That was fantastic. There's actually lots of questions coming in already, so we will open it up to questions from the audience now. So, Alan, if you don't mind turning on your webcam, if it'll.
okay, turning on my webcam. Yes, okay.
Perfect. There we go. All right. So, for anybody who, just a reminder, you can type your questions into the chat box on the side of your screen. If your control panel has closed, you should see a little orange arrow near the top of your screen. If you click on that arrow, it'll expand again, and then you can use the chat box to type in your questions. And then I'll read them out, and Alan will answer them. So the first question in here is, can you increase yield and soil health over time by grazing a native stand lightly with short duration, so higher stocking density grazing, after the third leaf stage in spring, and then come back for a second graze later in the summer?
Well, that's a great question, and in fact that's a question that we're trying to really address a little bit. I guess the short answer is yes, I believe that you can. And there has been some anecdotal research that has been done, particularly down in North Dakota, in which they have really looked at past that three-leaf stage, looking at specific times and frequencies, how heavily you graze those pastures, and actually seeing stimulating regrowth of those particular cool seasons and maybe even warm season grasses to increase production. Soil organic carbon is often very much tied to net primary production. In other words, if you improve biomass production or forage biomass production, particularly in natives, and as I said, as much as you're improving the above ground biomass, the vast majority is also being improved below ground. So once again, yes, I believe that if you were able to graze it properly and at the right time to stimulate regrowth and increase net primary production, you could also increase soil organic carbon or carbon sequestration potential.
All right. So next question here, how are you able to verify the amount of carbon a certain type of plant sequesters?
Okay, that's a very good question. In our case, where we have those mixed pastures or our mixed simple and complex, we take a lot of detailed soil core samples. So in the case of each one of our paddocks there, we have 5 sites in which we are taking soil core samples on. Each site in itself has 5 different microsites associated with it, in which we can try to assess the variability associated with each one of those microsites within each site. The entire depth of the soil cores goes from essentially 0 to essentially 120 centimeters. At various gradations or various depths, we take that soil and then we have to process it and then measure the amount of soil organic carbon that has accumulated or is there. The challenges that we have with native grasses is that some of the native species do or are very deep rooted, and so that's some of the reasons why we have to go quite deep. Unlike annual cropping systems, it might only be 6 inches to a foot is all that we would have to worry about as far as the root material or the organic matter. So very quickly, we have to take these measurements throughout a number of years. In the case of the soil organic carbon values that we got from the simple and the complex ones, when we started the study in 2000, we've taken soil organic carbon measurements in 2000, 2004, 2008, 2011, 2014, and now in 2017. It takes a lot of time to be able to look and to measure, and you have to do it very accurately and very under controlled systems to be able to detect these differences. And that's part of the challenges and some of the interesting things that we're trying to do here in our research center.
All right, thanks. Next question here, have you done any research using winter fat in native pasture stands?
Well, that's a good question too. Winterfat is one of these native shrubs, and I didn't mention much on the shrubs. One thing that we did try to do on the reestablishment of the two mixed grasslands or grasses was that we had in the complex mix that we tried to also include winterfat and Nuttall saltbush. Both Nuttall saltbush and winterfat have very good forage quality values later in the fall-winter period of time. And for anybody who's familiar with winterfat, it's often considered the ice cream plant for grazing animals. So this was a process that we were hoping to see it establish. It did not really establish in our native mixtures. There is another research scientist here at Swift Current. His name is Dr. Mike Schellenberg, and one of his major area has been looking at development and selection of native or innate winterfat that's common to Canada or Western Canada versus the winterfat that you can get from Colorado or New Mexico. Is it possible that you can use some of those particular native strains or types? So Mike Schellenberg has been doing some fairly extensive work in that area, and if you are able to come to our tour, most definitely you'll see some of that work that's being undertaken by Dr. Schellenberg.
All right, next question here. Could you please give us the names again of the companies that sell native grass seed, if you have them?
Okay, now once again, I am just mentioning these three companies. That doesn't necessarily mean that other companies that you may know may not necessarily sell native seeds. I only had a chance to contact a few of these people that I know directly. So one of the companies is Crop Production Service. That is a company that's essentially the forage side is taken over from Viterra. And then the other one is North Star Seeds. That has a very extensive forage seed catalog. And then the final one was Brett Young. And they also have a fairly large listing of native grasses and some forms.
All right. Which native species? I have actually two questions that are similar but different. Both asking about native species that can be grown on either saline soils or on the wetter soil types.
Okay, that's a question that I'm probably not the expert in because I'm not an ecologist, but the Nuttall saltbush obviously can grow on very saline soils. We did have a study in which I was working with a salinity soil scientist, Dr. Harold Stapoon, who has retired now, in which we looked at a number of different natives as well as tame forages in a saline condition. We were looking at two sites in that case. One was in Oyen in Alberta, in a very severe to moderate or moderate to severe, and then another one to slight to moderate. And then another location was near Warner, Alberta, also very moderate to severe and slight to moderate. The Nuttall saltbush was able to grow in some of that area, but the main competitors or the main invasive weeds or weeds that it has to contend against is the foxtail barley. And foxtail barley is very aggressive. None of the other native grasses, such as the ones that I just mentioned in my study, western, northern, did very well in that regards. And so you have to be very careful when it comes to looking at native grasses in some of these saline areas. The slight to moderate, some of them would have a chance depending on the time that you establish it, the various moisture regimes that you have, you might be able to get it established. But there are other grasses, and this is where I would probably shift my hat to some other more aggressive grasses, which are the tame grasses, that would be able to outcompete the foxtail barley and then get established.
All right. Next question here. Did you find any difference in utilization between the simple native blends and complex blends?
So in our case, we were grazing it all to a standard conservative utilization. So in our case, we were at that 40 to 50% utilization, which is what I stated earlier is the recommendation. We really didn't necessarily see any difference on that regards because that was one of our benchmarks that we were shooting for. As I said earlier in that picture of the grazing preference work, we hope to follow up some of the work that we did on the simple and complex and looking at what are the preferences at different times and in different mixtures for those native grasses. And so that's something that we hope to look in the future on.
Next one here, what time of the year is optimal for seeding native grasses, and should a nurse crop be used?
Well, this is a very good question, and there will be various answers to this. For our location, for the more drier areas, we do not recommend a nurse crop or a companion crop. Although some places where you have higher rainfalls, the nurse crop or the companion crop can provide some competition against the weeds or protection. And so in some of those cases, that may make very good sense. Native grasses generally are very poor competitors or poor competitors against weeds. And that's the reason why, if our success looked very successful in our seeding of natives, it's because we spent a good amount of time to try to control the weeds. And seeding into a stubble field, obviously that had been annually cropped for some time, there wasn't a lot of weeds associated with that. Once again, in our situation, we find that the spring seeding is the best. Although you can try also in the late fall or dormant seeding, but for our situation and for the years that we've had, the spring seeding has been the most successful for us. Once again, you're going to have to look at your particular situation, your particular environment, and what you're able to do in your particular operation.
All right, so just to let everybody know, we have 2 more questions here. So we'll do those and then we'll wrap up. So if you do have any burning questions you want to get in, type them in really quickly, but if not, we'll finish up after this. So can native forages be as productive as tame forages if you're growing them for hay?
Yes, I think very much so. There are some native grasses, particularly green edo grass, as well as western and northern wheatgrass. As you know, there was a time where you could actually get cultivars. Cultivars are really forages that have made selections on. Really, they've been sort of based on productions. And so there's been western wheatgrass and northern wheatgrass. And so some of these native grasses do have very good production. So you have to look at that aspect of what you want to do. And you're going to have to balance that to how you want to utilize that particular pasture or grass system. I think how I look at this is that when you look at natives, there are different times in which they're better suited to be grazed. There's various times that you might be able to get a hay crop off of it, but you may not want to come back and stress it again. Native grasses are not necessarily been developed for high hay productions. As you can imagine, as a native species, they're just trying to get by and to stay in the system for a long period of time. So some of the native grasses you can look at for hay production, but probably the tame species would probably be better suited for that.
Okay. Our last question here. Have you studied the effects on microorganisms?
The microorganisms pertaining to the soil or to the plant or to the animal? Which one?
I'm assuming the way the question came in that it was about the soil, but I don't have any further information.
Yes, that's another area that we're really interested in because obviously the soil microbial population has a huge impact as far as the breakdown of the organic matter as well as being a component of the organic matter. We're trying our very best to look in that area, and at Swift Current we've just hired a new soil microbiologist, and so that is an area that we hope to really explore with natives. He is now doing a project with me that's with polycrops. And I'm sure for some of you out there, this is not new, in which looking at annual cereals or annual brassicas or other types of forage or plant material in which they have a high ability to increase your soil organic carbon. So we're looking at their production. We have a study that will start this year in which we'll be grazing different brassicas and cereal forages, and looking at not only the organic matter but also how these different annual forages can be utilized under a fall grazing scenario.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to answer all those. Those were lots of great questions coming in. So I just have a couple more things to let everybody know about before they go here. One is how to get more information and science-based production advice. There are 2 free email lists I would encourage you to sign up for if you're not already, the AAFC one as well as our BCRC blog. If you have a Twitter, Facebook, or a YouTube account, you can connect with either of us there as well. So very shortly, as soon as this webinar is over, you're going to be asked to complete a short survey that asks about tonight's session and what you're most interested in for future webinar topics. We do need your feedback to do the best job that we can to make sure the information we're giving you is both useful and meaningful to you and helps you make an informed decision on your operation. So I'm making the list for next year's webinar right now, so if you do have any suggestions, I would really appreciate the feedback. Please don't hesitate, or please do complete the survey and don't hesitate to contact me with any questions, concerns, or comments you have at any time. You're going to be receiving an email from me as well within the next couple of days with a link to watch the recording, as well as some supplemental information on native forages. So that's all I have for you tonight. Thank you very much for joining us from home. And on behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank Alan for volunteering your time and expertise tonight. Good night.
Thank you very much.